The firing range wasn't supposed to shake. It was built into the spinal armature of the Varellan Academy, armored with alloy so dense it distorted magnetic fields, designed to withstand everything from plasma misfires to bored cadets deliberately pushing their luck. It was, according to every manual, unbreakable under training conditions. Yet the wall at the far end had just pulsed, like something behind it had taken a slow breath. Instructor Coven flicked his mandibles in irritation, claws tapping against the railing. "And this," he announced to the gathered cadets, "is why you will never attempt to use a weapon on a Rift Aberrant." Lyra Hale, human, 5'6", sleep-deprived, and far too curious, raised an eyebrow. "Because it makes the wall do that?" A few aliens turned to stare at her as if she'd cracked a joke in a funeral temple. "That," Coven said sharply, "is the Aberrant acknowledging the presence of organic minds. It tests. It listens. And more importantly," he snapped out a hollow screen, "it adapts." On the display, grainy footage played, entire squads firing at a shimmering silhouette, shots bending, dissolving, or flattening midair. The thing moved without moving, a fold of geometry that refused to be solid or still. Weapons failed against it, kinetic, plasma, graviton, everything. Coven tapped the screen. "No weapon can stop it. It is not a creature. It is a response, a ripple of probability collapse interacting with physical space." The cadets murmured softly in fear. Lyra crossed her arms. "So why keep one behind a training wall?" Coven's mandibles clicked. "Because this is a military academy. We teach you what not to fight." There it was, the phrase she hated. Humans weren't good at. Don't. On the other side of the reinforced glass, the wall pulsed again, slightly brighter this time. A resonant hum slid through the floor like a distant drumbeat. Some species flinched. Lyra didn't. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "It's reacting to us." "It always reacts," Coven said. "But reaction does not equal vulnerability." Lyra tapped the rail thoughtfully. "Everything has a vulnerability." "Cadet Hale," Coven warned, "you will not be testing that hypothesis." Lyra didn't answer. Not because she agreed, but because the hum in the wall had changed. It was no longer an echo. It was a pattern, like something inside was learning the rhythm of their breathing. And Lyra Hale had questions. The kind of questions no sane cadet wanted to answer. Lyra stayed behind after the rest of the cadets filed out of the range, their conversations hushed and uneven, like the room had stolen some of their confidence, and refused to give it back. The overhead lights dimmed automatically as the group dispersed, leaving the space draped in a muted flicker that felt almost reverent. Instructor Coven did not notice she hadn't left. He was too busy muttering into his tablet, filing whatever report instructors wrote when training equipment behaved like it had a heartbeat. Lyra waited until the last alien cadet's footsteps faded down the hall before she approached the observation barrier again, letting her palm hover near the glass without touching it. The wall on the far end of the range shifted once more. Not violently, not dramatically, but with an unsettling smoothness, like a curtain stirring from an unseen draft. The faint pulse she had noticed earlier now carried the artifact of intention. It reminded her of watching the ocean on her homeworld, back when she was too young to understand that Death-world oceans weren't romantic, they were opportunistic. The surface looked calm until you realized the movement underneath was purposeful, always scanning, always aware. Whatever lay behind the reinforced panel behaved the same way, except this ocean waited for minds instead of prey. "It is not admiring you," Coven said without looking up, although the edge in his tone revealed he disliked being surprised. "It doesn't perceive individuals. Only disturbances in probability space." Lyra turned slightly, arms folded loosely. "Then why did the pulse sync to the room's biofeedback earlier? You saw the monitors shift." Coven finally looked up, irritation settling into his posture like an old reflex. "Because that is what it does. The Aberrant doesn't learn you. It learns the environment. Every breath we exhale shapes probabilities, and it explores those shapes. Always searching for collapse points. That sounds like vulnerability, she said, voice steady but thoughtful, as if merely tracing a line through an equation. Cadet Hale, Coven replied with a weary exhale. Your species has this persistent, troublesome belief that everything that moves can be challenged. This is one of the rare exceptions. The aberrant is not a foe to be defeated. It is a phenomenon to be avoided. She didn't argue, but he could see in her expression that she didn't accept the premise. Humans rarely did. Instead of escalating, she stepped closer to the barrier, studying the barely visible ripples under the surface of the wall. The aberrant wasn't active, not fully, but it was aware in the same way dark water was aware of anything that touched it. It adjusts to energy patterns, she murmured, and it neutralizes anything that behaves predictably. That is why no weapon can stop it, Coven confirmed. Every projectile, every beam, every field, they all carry an identifiable signature. The moment such a signature enters its range, it erases the conditions that allowed the weapon to function. Lyra absorbed this quietly. Then she asked, with complete sincerity, "Has anyone tried a weapon that doesn't behave like a weapon?" Coven stared at her, as if she had spoken a sentence in a language not yet invented. "That question," he said slowly, "is the single most dangerous sequence of words uttered in this academy today." Lyra didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't soften the line of thought. The pulse behind the wall fluttered again, more distinctly this time, as though responding to the conversation rather than the atmosphere. "It's listening," she said softly. "No," Coven corrected. "It is anticipating. And that is much worse." But Lyra's attention had already shifted inward, gears turning in a way that rarely ended well for an instructor trying to maintain regulations. When she finally stepped away from the barrier, Coven felt the relief of someone who had narrowly avoided disaster without understanding why. Lyra, however, had already chosen the next question she was going to pursue. And somewhere inside the wall, the aberrant seemed to wait for it. The academy dormitory block settled into its late-night rhythm, quiet but not restful. The halls were lit in low amber, a deliberate design choice meant to calm species with widely differing circadian systems, though it always made Lyra feel like she was walking through a ship under emergency power. She preferred the dark of her room, where shadows didn't try to soothe her. She dropped into her desk chair, letting the surface screen flicker awake beneath her fingertips. Lines of the day's data streamed upward. Energy scatter readings from the barrier chamber, subspace pressure measurements, fluctuation cycles of the aberrant's pulses. All the values every instructor insisted she not look at. All the values she had already memorized. The aberrant adjusted to predictable signatures. Weapons were predictable. Power systems, predictable. Chemical reactions, magnetic fields, heat signatures, predictable. But humans, she thought, leaning back slowly, humans are inconsistent at the molecular level. An evolutionary trait from centuries of surviving environments that wanted them extinct. Their biology was a mess of redundancies, improvisations, inefficient patches, yet computation-resistant in its variability. So the question she had posed to Instructor Coven lingered like a spark. What happens when you introduce something that behaves like a weapon only after it is already in motion? She brought up a blank calculation grid and began scribbling formulas, half intuitive, half rebellious. She sketched the outline of a device, not a gun, not exactly, but a vector. Something inert until activated by proximity. Something the aberrant would not interpret as a threat until it was too late to adjust. Human engineering embraced chaos. That was their edge. She paused, tapping the stylus against her knee. The device itself wasn't the issue. She could build the framework with Academy Workshop scraps in half an hour. The question was activation. A weapon that functioned by changing state mid-trajectory required a trigger that didn't rely on predictable fields or emissions. Then she remembered something. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a tiny object, irregular, cloudy, unimpressive. A piece of ferrocrystal from Titan's broken range, one of a few she'd kept before leaving Earth border space. Most cadets collected decorative hollow trinkets. She collected oddities that made scanners glitch. The fragment thrummed faintly in her palm, reacting not to heat or light but to intentionality, a bizarre property discovered by researchers who couldn't explain it. Humans had a habit of discovering things the universe didn't want explained. "There you are," she murmured. A trigger that responded not to electricity or pressure, but to cognitive focus. Something the Aberrant could not predict because it could not model thought state fluctuations, especially not human ones. Her pulse quickened. This was no longer a question of curiosity. She had the blueprint for a weapon defined not by force, but by unpredictability. Her screen chimed suddenly. Lyra jumped slightly, not out of fear, but irritation, and checked the alert. A message from Instructor Coven, timestamped 5 minutes ago. Cadet Hale. Do not approach the range chamber after hours. This is not a suggestion. She stared at the message for a moment. Then she calmly closed it. The Aberrant had pulsed in rhythm with her earlier. It had been waiting for action. And she was very much planning to give it one. 2 strikes, she whispered to herself. Let's see what the third looks like. The Academy's fabrication bay was technically closed after 2200 hours, but the automated systems didn't enforce the rules so much as politely request compliance. A polite request had never stopped a motivated human before. The doors slid open at her approach with a soft hiss, bathing her in pale industrial light. The quiet inside was dense, machines sleeping, tools folded neatly, printers dormant under their sterile covers. Lyra moved with purpose, but not haste. Haste revealed intent, calm obscured it. She set her pack on the nearest workbench and powered up a microlathe, its surface humming to life with a rising, insect-like whir. A schematic she'd drafted earlier materialized on the bay's central projector. A minimalist cylinder, hollow at the core, ringed with channels designed for inertia-assisted ignition. Not a firearm. Not a grenade. Something stranger. Something the Aberrant would not recognize until it was already inside its event horizon. She dismantled the training drone first, stripping out its inertial gyro and reconfiguring it to function as a spin stabilizer. Next came a decommissioned plasma igniter. She gutted it cleanly, keeping only the coil housing. Human tools made precise work feel almost intimate. Every screw removed, every circuit excised felt like sculpting rather than engineering. Her hands worked on autopilot. Her mind worked on the problem. Predictability. That was the Aberrant's advantage, and the Empire's excuse. Declare something unstoppable, and no one had to try stopping it. But Lyra had spent her entire life on a death world being told threats couldn't be stopped. Storms, quakes, beasts, toxic blooms. And yet, somehow, humanity had survived every one. Not through superior strength or tech, but through sheer unwillingness to accept inevitability. She took out the ferrocrystal fragment and set it on the bench. The lab lights refracted strangely off its surface, as though it were slightly misaligned with the rest of the room. "You're the heart," she murmured. She embedded the crystal into the hollow core of the device, securing it with a thin lattice of carbon mesh. The lattice didn't power the crystal, it merely held it in place. The crystal didn't need power. It responded to intention, to focus, to the simple act of a mind deciding something should happen. She let her breathing slow. A tool scanned the object, its readout flickering with errors. Good. If machines couldn't categorize it, either could the Aberrant. She assembled the vector casing around the core, sealing it with a magnetic weld. The completed device lay on the bench, unassuming, almost crude, like a prototype made by someone with more ideas than resources. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't feel like one. That was the point. Lyra lifted it gently, testing the weight. Perfect balance. No signature. No predictable field. Just potential bounded in metal and defiance. Her wristcom vibrated. A campus-wide notice blinked across her display. Alert, Range Chamber 3, Spatial Anomaly Fluctuation. All personnel keep clear. The Aberrant was waking. Reacting. Anticipating. Lyra exhaled once through her nose, quiet and steady. Not fear, alignment. As though the universe had simply confirmed the direction she was already walking. She slipped the device into her pack and sealed the workshop behind her. The hall outside felt colder, humming with distant structural tension. Far beneath the academy, range chamber 3 pressed outward against its reinforced boundaries like something breathing too deeply. Coven had said 2 strikes had already been delivered. The third would not be the Aberrant's. It would be hers. Range chamber 3 lay 3 levels below the main academy complex, its walls sheathed in density-folded alloy that made the air feel subtly compressed. Even before Lyra reached the entrance corridor, she felt the shift, like gravity exhaling wrong. The lights along the bulkheads flickered not randomly, but rhythmically, as though matching a heartbeat that wasn't hers. A lockdown field shimmered over the chamber doors, translucent and humming. Not military grade, academy protocol never assumed students would be suicidal, but enough to discourage casual entry. Lyra was not entering casually. She approached the field, watching its surface ripple. The pack on her shoulder felt heavier now, as if the device within sensed proximity, readiness, or maybe just the tension she carried in her muscles. Her wristcom pinged an access denial the moment she tried to override the lock. She didn't bother trying again. She stepped back, scanned the corridor, then knelt by a maintenance junction panel. The screws were standard academy issue, security through inconvenience, not impenetrability. She pried it open and slipped her hand inside, fingertips brushing the bundle of thermoregulator conduits. A latent warmth spread across her skin. Perfect. Most academy lockdown fields were shaped by thermal variation. A slight, controlled surge could destabilize the projection for just long enough. She pinched the conduit junction, applied pressure, and twisted the temperature regulator half a degree off calibration. The field blinked, wavered, collapsed for one breath. Lyra stepped through before it could recover. The chamber's interior swallowed her in dim light and impossible quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something listening. She had been here earlier in the day, surrounded by cadets, instructors, equipment, but now, with the space empty, the scale of it pressed inward. The air trembled softly, as though the room held a tuning fork no one could see. The wall at the far end, the one that wasn't a wall, rippled once. Subtle. Acknowledgement. Lyra felt the hair rise along her arms. "You knew I was coming," she said under her breath, though she wasn't speaking to be heard. More to mark the moment. To make it real. The Aberrant pulsed again, a pressure wave that didn't travel through the air but through the probabilities around her. A sense of being evaluated without eyes, without intent, without malice. Just pure recognition of her presence as a variable entering its calculus. Lyra removed the device from her pack. Held it delicately. It didn't glow or hum or shift. It simply existed. That alone made it dangerous. She walked deeper into the chamber, each step accompanied by subtle distortions, lights dimming, shadows thinning, the faint sensation that space itself sagged beneath her weight. The Aberrant was testing. Probing. Not with force, but with possibility. She stopped 5 meters from the threshold where the alloy wall blurred, the boundary between normal physics and whatever the Aberrant inhabited. Instructor Coven's warnings echoed in her memory. No weapon can stop it. Weapons failed because they announced themselves. Because they behaved according to rules. Because they carried signatures the Aberrant could erase with perfect efficiency. But this was different. This device wasn't a weapon until she decided it was one. And that decision couldn't be predicted. Lyra inhaled slowly, centering herself, feeling the ferrocrystal core resonate faintly with her intention. Not power, not command, just alignment. A readiness shared between object and wielder, like a bowstring drawing itself taut. The Aberrant pulsed again. Stronger. The chamber trembled. Lyra tightened her grip. "Third impact," she whispered, and stepped forward. The threshold was not a line but a sensation. A soft, Visceral tug as Lyra crossed from Academy physics into the Aberrant's influence, like stepping into water that didn't have temperature. The air thickened around her, the chamber lights stretching into fragile filaments before snapping back into shape. Even sound warped. Her breath echoed a fraction of a second late, like the room was deciding whether or not to permit the noise. The Aberrant pulsed again, but this time the pulse wasn't subtle. It passed through her, not like force but like inquiry. A disassembly of probability. A cataloging of every potential trajectory her existence could take, from standing still, to stepping forward, to dropping the device, to never having entered the chamber at all. It wasn't reading her. It was sampling versions of her, testing which ones might survive the next moment. Lyra swallowed once, controlled. This was the worst place to hesitate. Hesitation had a shape, and the Aberrant reacted to shapes. She kept her thoughts narrow, focused, not disciplined but chaotic, a scatter of impressions, rain on steel, her father lifting driftwood on the tightened coast, the way current pulled against her legs when storms rolled in. Memories with no pattern. And the Aberrant hesitated. Good. Her device rested in her palm, light but grounding. It still looked inert, no light, no movement, no hum. Perfect. Anything more would have made it predictable. Anything less would have made it unusable. The wall in front of her rippled. Not outward this time. Inward. A slow intake of the surrounding space, like a lung drawing breath. The Aberrant sensed the object she carried, not as a weapon, but as a variable whose future could not be mapped. That alone made it dangerous. The chamber dimmed further. Lyra felt pressure on her bones. Not pain. Compression, like the Aberrant was shaping possibilities around her, trying to find one where her actions could be neutralized before they occurred. But this was her advantage. She was human. Humans acted before the universe finished calculating. She stepped closer. Probability thickened, resisting her movements like slow mud. Her foot sank through an echo of itself, landing half a second before she felt the impact. The air shimmered, bending around her like gravity had turned sideways. The Aberrant pulsed harder. Her device rattled, just once, a faint mechanical tremor, as the ferrocrystal core resonated with the growing pressure in the chamber. It wasn't being activated, not yet, but it was aware of her focus. It aligned with her intention as naturally as a dropped stone aligned with gravity. Lyra stopped only 1 meter from the shifting wall. Her mind settled. Not calm. Aligned. She raised the device. The Aberrant reacted instantly. The wall surged outward, collapsing the surrounding possibilities like a tidal wave of pure probability, trying to overwrite every future in which she acted. Lights exploded overhead, the chamber floor fractured like warped glass, and her body shuddered as reality folded dangerously close around her skin. The Aberrant pushed. Lyra pushed back. No weapon could stop it. But this wasn't a weapon. Not until she decided it was. She locked her thoughts onto a single point. A vector of activation, intent condensed into a razor's edge. And the ferrocrystal flared. Not with light. With choice. The chamber convulsed. A soundless impact struck the Aberrant from the inside, as if possibility itself recoiled. And for the first time since the Academy was built, the Aberrant lost synchronization. The universe noticed. It had no choice. The synchronized hum of the chamber, ever present, ever balanced, shattered like glass under a hammer. Not loudly, not violently, but in a way that made the air convulse and recover 1 beat too late, as though reality had momentarily forgotten how to hold itself together. Lyra staggered back a half step, not from pain, but from the sudden absence of pressure. The Aberrant's probability field, once crushingly tight, had loosened in a single lurching collapse, leaving a vacuum of intent around her. The chamber felt hollow. Wrong. Like standing at the eye of a storm that hadn't yet accepted the idea of an eye. The ferrocrystal in her palm still glowed with decision, a faint seismic trembling radiating outward from its core. The charge wasn't energy. It was alignment, The unmistakable sensation of a trajectory once dormant now locked onto a singular outcome. Her outcome. Across the chamber, the wall convulsed as though struggling to regain coherence. It didn't simply ripple this time. It flickered, breaking into shards of overlapping geometry, each shard showing a slightly different version of the space she stood in. In one, she hadn't stepped forward. In another, the device lay shattered at her feet. In another, she was simply gone. The Aberrant was trying to reassert probability dominance. Trying to select a version of events where she had already failed. Lyra tightened her grip. "No," she whispered, not as defiance, but as a correction. The Aberrant pulsed again, but the pulse wavered, stuttering across fractured possibility space. Where it touched the ferrocrystal's influence, it scattered, unable to collapse her trajectory into any of its chosen outcomes. For the first time, the Aberrant encountered a future it could not prune. And it reacted badly. The chamber lights died at once. Darkness swallowed everything. But the darkness wasn't empty. It held pressure, immense, directionless pressure. Like the Aberrant was trying to force her into a version of herself the device couldn't protect. Spatial vectors twisted violently. The floor beneath her feet elongated, then contracted, then folded into itself with a soft, nauseating throb. Lyra braced, spreading her stance. Her knees buckled, but she stayed upright. Her head rang with the silent roar of collapsing possibilities, each one shredding itself as the Aberrant tried to isolate a scenario where it survived unchallenged. But her device pulsed again, weak but perfectly timed, snapping the collapsing timelines like overstretched wire. The Aberrant convulsed. For a heartbeat, Lyra glimpsed something beyond the shifting wall, not shape, not creature, but structure. A root system of probability branching infinitely, a living network of outcomes that writhed in response to her defiance. A system built to be unopposed. A system now facing contradiction. The ferrocrystal warmed in her hand, faint but steady. It wasn't reacting to the Aberrant, it was reacting to her. To the commitment she had made an instant earlier, to the vector she had chosen with absolute clarity. That clarity was something the Aberrant could not model. Human unpredictability wasn't randomness. It was intentional chaos. And the Aberrant had no defense against a future chosen by a mind that refused to obey probability. Lyra inhaled, slow and deep, anchoring herself in the only reality she had decided to inhabit. The chamber shuddered again, and the wall tore open not physically, but conceptually, stretching into a wound of fractal light and churning darkness. Something inside tried to pull her in. She didn't move. Instead, she raised the device again, letting its trembling vector align with the newly exposed core of the Aberrant. "Round 3, she said softly. And as the Aberrant surged forward, she activated the device fully. Activation wasn't a sound or flash or recall. It wasn't cinematic. It was immediate. A single moment in which the vector in Lyra's hand stopped being an object and became a rule the universe suddenly had to obey, even as the Aberrant tried desperately to rewrite the rules around her. The ferrocrystal didn't glow so much as assert itself. A pressure radiated outward in a smooth, expanding sphere, invisible yet absolute, like a boundary drawn by something that understood causality, but had no interest in respecting its usual direction. The Aberrant struck first. Reality folded toward Lyra like a collapsing lung, a tidal wave of probability inversion designed to crush every possible future she could still inhabit. The air warped into razor-thin slices, each one representing a version of her the Aberrant wanted to select, overwrite, or erase entirely. She felt every one of those slices brush against her consciousness, all the ways she could have failed, all the paths where the device misfired or dissolved or never existed at all. But the vector's field held. Not by shielding her. By refusing to agree with the Aberrant's conclusions. The collapsing futures shattered harmlessly against her position, dissolving into a fine haze of unrealized possibility. For the first time since its containment, the Aberrant recoiled. The chamber relit in a stuttering flicker, revealing the warped geometry around her. The walls bulged then snapped taut, the floor heaved, and the shifting lattice of probability lines in front of her contracted sharply, like an organism preparing to defend its core. A sound, not quite auditory, rolled through the chamber. A deep, resonant thrum, the sound of something ancient and unspeakably complex recognizing a threat outside its logical framework. Lyra stepped forward. The Aberrant flinched. The wall in front of her opened again, but this time it wasn't a wound. It was a desperate retraction, a pulling back of probabilistic tendrils as the entity tried to calculate a response that didn't exist. Because the device in her hand wasn't powered by physics. It wasn't predictable. It wasn't static. It was keyed to her mind, her intent, her decision to act. And her mind was the one thing the Aberrant could not map. Space rippled in a violent snap, and the Aberrant surged outward with raw, unshaped potential. Probabilities overlapping so fast they whined like overstrained metal. It wasn't attacking her. It was trying to overwhelm her with futures. To drown her in choices until she lost focus. She recognized the tactic. It was the same way death world storms tried to confuse hunting animals, overwhelm the senses, disorient, break intent. Lyra had grown up in that chaos. She breathed once, then tightened her grip on the vector. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping into the surge. "Human brains don't break that easily." The ferrocrystal thrummed with her conviction, resonating outward in a ripple that sliced through the Aberrant's projected futures. The surge collapsed, scattered like dust under a sudden wind. The Aberrant recoiled again. That was when Lyra felt the shift. Not in space, not in time, but in the entity's attention. It had underestimated her. Now it understood. This wasn't a cadet with a prototype. This wasn't an experiment. This was an anomaly. Her. The Aberrant twisted, probability lines snapping into a defensive spiral. But she was already moving, stepping forward into the collapsing geometry, letting the vector's field push back against the impossible without hesitation or doubt. For the first time in its existence, the Aberrant tried to retreat. Lyra's voice cut cleanly through the convulsing chamber. Too late. And with one final, deliberate step, she brought the device into direct contact with the Aberrant's core. The moment of contact was not an explosion. It was a decision. The two forces, Aberrant probability and human intent, met like opposing fronts of a storm, not with sound or light, but with a violent stillness that swallowed every other sensation. The chamber froze mid-tremor. Dust hung suspended in the air. The fractured outlines of alternate futures went silent, held like sketches on invisible glass. Lyra didn't move. She couldn't move. Her hand remained pressed to the Aberrant's exposed core, the ferrocrystal at the heart of her vector thrumming in a harmonic that her bones felt more than heard. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, steady, stubborn, defiant. For a breathless instant, the Aberrant tried to absorb the device, to rewrite it as a harmless variable, to overwrite the vector of her choice with one that led nowhere. But the ferrocrystal wasn't a variable. It was a constant, shaped by a human mind that refused collapse. The Aberrant faltered. A lattice of branching timelines snapped inward, collapsing like brittle ice. The chamber flickered with half-formed realities, versions of her stepping back, failing, vanishing, but each collapsed the moment they touched the vector's expanding field. Lyra felt her consciousness stretch, pulled taut across a widening gulf of possibilities. The Aberrant wasn't trying to kill her anymore. It was trying to incorporate her, absorb her into its probability matrix, and reduce her intent to pure noise. She felt it reach into her thoughts like cold fingers, mapping her memories, sampling her fears, pressing against her sense of self. She grit her teeth. No! The word wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. The vector echoed it. A single resonant pulse blasted through the chamber, snapping probability branches by the thousands. The Aberrant recoiled violently, its core warping into a spiral of jagged geometry as it attempted to retreat behind layers of distorted reality. But Lyra didn't break contact. She stepped forward. And in doing so, she pushed the device fully into the Aberrant's core. The world buckled. A shockwave rippled through the chamber, though no air moved. A silent detonation of conflicting rules. Lyra saw flashes. A coastline bathed in acidic rain. A titan storm splitting the sky. 1,000 possible deaths she never took. 1,000 lives she never lived. A network of probability roots twisting in agony, unable to align. A human figure standing in the middle of impossible storms, refusing to fall. Then the Aberrant screamed. It wasn't a sound, but the psychic backlash of an entity built on absolute prediction encountering a future it could not calculate. And could not survive. The chamber convulsed in a seizure of collapsing realities. The walls stretched and shrank in chaotic pulses. The floor cracked like thawing ice. The air vibrated with the tension of a universe forced to acknowledge something contradictory to its structure. Lyra felt her knees weaken, the strain flooding her muscles. The vector grew hot. The core flared. Her vision dimmed at the edges. But the Aberrant was unraveling. Its core fractured into fragments of light and shadow, each shard representing a rejected future it had once held stable. Now they tore free, spinning outward, evaporating into nothing. The entity's entire construct shivered, then began to contract around the vector, forced into a single collapsing point. A singularity of defeated probability. Lyra's breath hitched. She wasn't pushing anymore. The Aberrant was falling. And then, with a sound like the universe snapping a taut wire, the construct imploded. Light vanished. Pressure vanished. The chamber exhaled. The Aberrant was gone. But Lyra did not fall. She stood in the dark, trembling, the vector cooling in her hand. One thought surfaced through the fog of adrenaline and collapsing reality. No weapon can stop it. The instructors were right. Weapons couldn't. But a human armed with intent? That was something else entirely. Silence stretched through range chamber 3 like a living thing, thick enough to press against her ears. Lyra lowered the vector slowly, her fingers trembling as though the device still carried the Aberrant's weight. The chamber lights, broken from the previous chaos, blinked weakly, casting fractured shadows along the warped walls. Every surface looked wrong, but stable. The impossible had happened, and yet she was still standing. For a long moment she simply breathed. Each inhale and exhale was deliberate, a rhythm that reminded her she was still anchored to a single, unfractured reality. Around her, shards of collapsed probabilities shimmered faintly in the corners of vision, like smoke caught in a sunbeam, remnants of the Aberrant's presence. They pulsed softly, as if sighing themselves out of existence, dissolving into nothing. Lyra's mind reeled, tracing the threads of what had just occurred. The Aberrant had been an apex of prediction, a living lattice of inevitability, unchallenged for decades. Every test, every cadet, every weapon had failed because nothing had been able to act outside expectation. But she had acted. She had chosen. That choice, a human choice, had become the vector of change. Humans were chaotic, yes, but their chaos carried purpose. Intent was the key, not brute force. Her pulse slowed as the chamber settled. The alloy walls no longer pulsed. No pressure waves vibrated through the floor. Even the residual hum of probability that had hovered like a second atmosphere was gone. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant the universe had been nudged off its axis and was now recalibrating. Lyra exhaled, letting her knees lock beneath her. She had won, not because she was stronger or faster, but because she had dared to defy the rules laid down by generations of fear. The vector, inert now, sat heavy in her hands, a testament to human unpredictability. She straightened and took a slow step back, hearing the faint echo of her boots across the fractured floor. Somewhere, far above her, alarms must have been blaring, instructors panicking. Coven's voice, firm, clipped, probably angry, would find her eventually. But for now, there was only the aftermath, the soft, absurdly beautiful sense of having reshaped reality with thought and will alone. Lyra let herself smile, small, defiant. So much for impossible, she whispered, voice carried lightly across empty space. She looked down at the vector one last time. It wasn't just a tool. It wasn't a weapon. It was proof the universe could be confronted, challenged, even rewritten, not by force, but by the deliberate choice to act. She turned, leaving the chamber behind. The aberrant was gone. But something lingered, a memory of impossibility broken, a lesson learned. A warning, perhaps, to any who might think that absolute prediction could withstand the unexpected. Humans thrived on unpredictability. Humans chose. And Lyra Hale had chosen first. The doors of Range Chamber 3 closed behind her, and somewhere deep in the academy, reality exhaled.